Hello, I'm Andy Karski, and I will be talking about the judges and their times. So, to break up this little talk I'll be giving, I have three sections: judges, idols, and kings. So, we'll talk about each of those in more detail. I can give you more of an intro, but I think the book of Judges speaks very well for itself. So, we're just going to read most of chapter 2 of the book of Judges. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua, and of the elders who outlived him, and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance, at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim north of Mount Gaash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up, who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, "Because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did." The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. So, from this text, what we see is a cycle described. And that cycle looks like this. Following God under a judge, the judge dies, then the people do evil and serve idols like Baal, arouse the Lord's anger, raiders come, and then God raises up a judge to save until that judge dies, and then the cycle repeats itself. So, this cycle in some of the judges is very straightforward. The very first judge mentioned in the book of Judges is Othniel, and really, it's pretty much exactly this story with his name inserted there. We don't know almost anything else about him. Some of the other judges, we get bits and pieces of their life beyond this cycle, but what we find is somewhat disturbing. We've got judges like insert judge name here, Gideon, who he, saved Israel, but then he also had an idol that he had on the side at the end of his life. So certainly the judges are not always great moral examples, but they are raised up by God to save Israel. So that raises the question then, who were the judges if they weren't always moral examples? Well, I shared a couple of stories already. Judges is actually full of great stories. And they're not always super clear about what you should think after you read the story. Aside from this introductory framework of Israel was saved, we have some confusing things. So we have, Shamgar and the ox goad. It's one of my favorite stories, about 2 verses, how Shamgar killed 100 Philistines with an ox goad, and he too saved Israel. And that's all we know about Shamgar. And we've got Deborah over here, the only female judge named in the book of Judges, who was a great military leader, and certainly, inspired the people around her. We've got Jephthah here, who saved Israel, but in the process of doing so, vowed that he would sacrifice the first person he saw coming home, and that first person happened to be his daughter coming out with a tambourine. And then we have, Gideon, I mentioned, who surrounded a village with, a small group of people armed with pots and pans. I should say it surrounded an army. And with nothing but pots and torches, he scared them, and the Lord saved Israel through that. And then, of course, we all know about Samson, who was able to knock down pillars and take out a whole bunch of Philistines in the process through his great strength. But he certainly had his moral issues. So, these are the judges we read about. In the downtimes of Israel, when the judges were not saving, we were talking about idolatry and serving Baal. So, who was Baal? Baal is this little idol dude over here with the green hat. This is, the word Baal is used to apply to actually several different gods, but it kind of congeals, especially as revealed in the Bible, to describe this Canaanite god of storms and sky. So the story is somewhat fragmented in the records that we have from that time, but there's a creator god named El, who is actually not all-powerful like our God is, but he created Baal, who then rose up and sort of usurped his power and partnered with a goddess named Ashtoreth, who was the goddess of fertility. And so the way that Baal and Ashtoreth were worshipped was through temple prostitution, things that sort of echoed their functions as the god of sky and the god of fertility. There was also child sacrifice involved. We learned that in Jeremiah. That's one of the ways that Baal was worshipped. So these are terrible things, right? And you think, well, who would worship Baal? I mean, so glad that's not happening anymore. But if you put yourself back into the shoes of the Israelites, you think about you're in this a foreign land, an area you haven't been in for that many generations, and the people around you are worshiping this god, and they're doing it because they say, well, if I worship Baal, he's the god of the sky, maybe I'll get more rain for my harvest this year. And if I worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of fertility, maybe I'll be able to have people to work that field because I'll have kids. And you start to hear people doing this all around you, and you think, well, it can't hurt, right? It's like my lucky shirt. I'm going to go stop at Baal's temple and, just do all the things I can do to try to have success here. So I could see how Israel would slip into this pattern. But it also is totally against what God had commanded just a couple generations before. So I think that the principle of forgetting the past, that is definitely a theme in the Old Testament and in the Bible. So where did this lead? We had Baal worship happening and Judges, but we learn in the last 4 chapters of the book of Judges that things can get really, really bad for Israel in this situation. So there's 2 stories that are shared here. One is of Micah and his Levite. Micah's got an idol that he fashions, and he gets a Levite who's supposed to be a priest of God to come and serve in the temple with him with this idol. And this becomes such an object of envy to the people around that an entire tribe of Israel, the Danites, captures the idol and takes the Levite. And it's definitely a story of moral degradation. The other story, which is symbolized by the picture on the lower right, is even more disturbing. Probably one of the most disturbing in the entire Bible. I can't even tell you all the details because I think it's too racy to talk about it in a talk like this, but you should go read it. It's a Levite and his concubine. So the fact that the Levite even has a concubine is disturbing. That's basically a servant with sexual favors. But he abuses this concubine. She runs away and goes back to her parents' house. He goes and finds her, and in the process of taking her home, they stop it off at a city where she gets accosted by a bunch of people in the city and eventually killed. And there's just a number of things that are disturbing about this, and the whole account is bookended by the phrase, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit." So this phrase is kind of indicative of the larger problem. Israel had no king. Now, certainly there were judges that stood up to save Israel, but there was no overarching authority that was responsible for the whole nation, continuously. So this whole account points to Jesus, right? We believe that when we interpret Scripture, that what we read is pointing forward to Jesus. That's our hermeneutic. That's how we read the Bible. So Jesus is the true king. However, that's not the reason that Israel gets up in arms about this. Israel actually recognizes they need a king. The last couple judges of Israel here were Samuel and Eli, not mentioned in the book of Judges, but in the book of First Kings. So Samuel, lives in the temple as a small boy. There's Eli, the old man, who's training him up. When Samuel's an old man, the people come to him with a request. All the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such that all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." So the people request a king. This request isn't bad. What's bad is the reason. They requested this king because they're rejecting the Lord as their king, because all the other nations have a king. Really, this is just the epitome of them falling into the practices of the nations around them, is to request a king as well. So, like I said, a king is ultimately what Israel should have, but that king should be the Lord, and that king is ultimately fulfilled in the person of Jesus, the true righteous king. Jesus also fulfills the role of judge ultimately as the one who saves Israel. So we believe that he's the ultimate fulfillment of those things. All right, so where are we going with all this? We look at this book of Judges, and as I said, we can quickly assume that this doesn't apply to us, right? This is all prior to Jesus, prior to the kings. Yeah, they were in the state of moral degradation, but I would challenge you to think about judges as leaders. We all have leaders in our lives. What does it look like to find a leader that you want to serve? What do you look for in a leader? What is your view of authority? The other question I would ask is, what in your life is an idol? What is the Baal of the people around you that you're tempted to serve over and above the true God of Israel? Thank you.